Clancy. Wheel him to the right.
So, Clancy rode to Wheeldon. He was racing on the wing with...
No one expected the man who defined Australian masculinity on screen to live a private life that shattered every conventional rule of love. For over a decade, Jack Thompson, the beloved national icon, the chiseled face of Australian cinema, shared his life, home, and heart with two women. Not just any two women, but sisters. And even more astonishing, they all agreed to it. To this day, it remains one of the most controversial love arrangements in Australian celebrity history. Was it a utopian experiment in open love, or a scandal hiding deeper emotional fractures? How could the man who represented honor, loyalty, and rugged independence in countless films choose a life so radically unconventional, and yet still be adored by the public? Jack Thompson wasn't just an actor. He was the face of an era, the voice of the outback, the conscience of a changing Australia. But what people saw on the screen was only half the story. Behind the scenes was a man shaped by trauma, loss, and an insatiable need to redefine what love and family meant. And when he finally opened up about his three-way relationship on national television, the country didn't know whether to admire his honesty or condemn his choices. In this video, we uncover the life of Jack Thompson like never before. From the highs of cinematic glory to the murky shadows of an intimate triangle that defied social norms. This is the story of a man who broke barriers not just in film, but in love. And whether you believe it was brave, selfish, or something in between, one thing is certain. Once you hear the full story, you'll never look at Jack Thompson the same way again. Jack Thompson emerged during a transformative era in Australian cinema. It was the early 1970s, and a new cultural identity was beginning to take shape on the big screen. Gone were the sanitized portrayals of British gentility. In their place came raw, authentic, distinctly Australian stories, full of dust, struggle, rebellion, and resilience. At the heart of this cinematic awakening stood Jack Thompson, tall, commanding, charismatic. He wasn't just an actor. He became the embodiment of a national ideal. Rugged, principled, and unmistakably Australian. Born in 1940 as John Hadley Payne, Jack's early life was anything but stable. His mother died when he was just a toddler, and his father, serving in the army, was unable to care for him. Jack was placed in foster care, then later adopted by the Thompson family, from whom he would take his famous surname. This fractured beginning would quietly echo throughout his personal philosophy and relationships in later life, though few could see it behind the strong, calm demeanor he presented to the world. He first captured attention in the television drama Spy Force, but it was his roles in Sunday Too Far Away, 1975, Breaker Morant, 1980, and The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, 1978, that catapulted him to icon status. His performances were layered, tough yet tender, introspective yet forceful. Critics praised him as the thinking man's hero. Audiences loved him. And the industry finally had its leading man who could carry the emotional and cultural weight of Australia's cinematic rebirth. But even as Jack Thompson represented the moral compass of the outback on screen, off-screen, he was quietly dismantling every traditional notion of love and partnership. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, he lived in what can only be described as a domestic arrangement far ahead of its time, or dangerously inappropriate, depending on whom you ask. Jack was simultaneously in a relationship with two women, Leona and Bunky King, sisters who not only knew about each other but lived under the same roof. It was more than just a fleeting affair or a scandalous fling. It was a genuine, long-term ménage à trois, a chosen family, as Jack would later call it. He believed in openness, in emotional truth over societal approval, and the women, both intelligent, independent, stayed not out of dependency, but by choice. For over 15 years, the trio navigated a shared life that would eventually make headlines and raise eyebrows across the nation. What made this arrangement even more provocative was that Jack didn't hide it. In fact, when he finally revealed it publicly during an interview on national television, he did so with calm confidence, as if daring the country to question a reality that had worked quietly for years. His admission set off a firestorm in the media. Was this the ultimate betrayal of traditional values, or a bold act of emotional honesty? This was the other side of Jack Thompson. Not the war hero or bush poet on screen, but the complex, unconventional man behind the legend. As we delve deeper, you'll begin to see how the very traits that made him so magnetic as an actor, vulnerability, courage, defiance, also shaped the most controversial choice of his personal life. Jack Thompson's rise was not marked by the kind of overnight fame often romanticized in celebrity tales. His journey was long, layered, and marked by emotional undercurrents that would later shape every decision in his life, both personal and professional. He was just 4 years old when his mother died, a loss that would become the first great fracture in his identity. Jack was separated from his father and sent to foster care, before being adopted by a poet and journalist named John Thompson. It was here, in a household filled with literature and debate, that Jack was first exposed to storytelling and the transformative power of language. But even in that intellectually rich environment, he would later recall feeling like an outsider, a child always adapting, always searching for stability and belonging. In his 20s, Jack briefly studied philosophy and anthropology at the University of Queensland. It was during this time that he began acting in amateur theater, discovering a medium where he could not only express himself, but inhabit the lives of others. A form of escape, perhaps, but also of communion. He worked as a male model to make ends meet, which only added to his aura, the rare combination of intellect and physical presence that would soon captivate audiences across the country. His breakthrough came with Spy Force, a television war series that showcased his on-screen gravitas. But it wasn't until Sunday Too Far Away, 1975, where he played a hardened yet sensitive sheep shearer, that Australia truly took notice. The film tapped into the country's deep connection to the land and labor. And Jack's performance gave masculinity a new face. Not cold and stoic, but nuanced, wounded, deeply human. From there, his career soared. Breaker Morant, 1980, was a critical milestone, not just for Thompson, but for the entire Australian film industry. His role as the principal defense lawyer Major Thomas placed him at the center of national conversations about justice, war, and colonial guilt. The film became an international success, earning him acclaim far beyond Australia's borders. For a time, Jack was the undisputed leading man of the Australian New Wave, starring in back-to-back hits that merged intellect with masculinity in a way few had managed before him. Behind this impressive ascent, however, was a man shaped by emotional fragility and philosophical yearning. Jack Thompson didn't just memorize lines, he embodied themes. His choice of roles reflected deeper personal quests: identity, loss, truth, defiance. And in his personal life, that same defiance of convention began to take shape. In the mid-1970s, Jack met Leona King, a strong-willed woman who shared his non-traditional worldview. The two became a couple. Not long after, Leona's younger sister, Bunky, moved in with them. What started as a shared household gradually evolved into something else, a romantic and emotional triad that defied every social expectation. There was no betrayal, no secrecy. Jack, Leona, and Bunky lived together as equals, raising eyebrows but refusing to apologize. This was the beginning of one of the most talked-about personal arrangements in Australian entertainment history. In private, the three maintained a harmonious, if unconventional, life. But the world outside wasn't ready. Gossip began to circulate. Industry insiders whispered. Journalists tried to dig. Still, Jack maintained a dignified silence, protecting what he saw as his truth. Not a scandal, but a choice. The escalation came when Jack, no longer interested in hiding, gave a candid interview on national television. He spoke not with arrogance or defensiveness, but with calm certainty. "I lived with two sisters for many years," he said, "and we loved each other. It worked." The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some admired his honesty and nonconformity. Others were outraged. Conservative circles accused him of moral degradation. Tabloids went into a frenzy. Yet, astonishingly, his career survived the firestorm. Unlike others whose private lives derailed their public image, Jack continued to be cast in major roles. He starred in The Man from Snowy River, 1982, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, 1983, alongside David Bowie, and numerous other films, proving that his talent and screen presence remained untouchable. But the strain was undeniable. Over time, the weight of public scrutiny, personal evolution, and internal dynamics wore down the trio's arrangement. The relationship with Bunky ended first, Followed later by the separation from Leona, Jack would later reflect on it with tenderness, not regret. It was a beautiful time. Complicated, yes, but full of love. At the peak of his fame, Jack Thompson had dared to live on his own terms. The choices he made off-screen mirrored the complexity of the roles he chose on-screen. Bold, conflicted, vulnerable, and unapologetically human. What most people didn't see behind Jack Thompson's calm demeanor and philosophical confidence was the emotional depth from which his choices sprang. To many, his relationship with two sisters seemed like an indulgence or an ego trip. But beneath the headlines and whispers, there existed a darker, quieter truth, one that had less to do with rebellion and more to do with loss. Jack never knew what a traditional family felt like. His mother died when he was a toddler, and the trauma of that early severance never fully healed. He was placed in state care, then moved between families until eventually adopted. This fractured sense of belonging left a mark, a constant craving for connection, for a sense of home that wasn't just structured by society's rules, but chosen freely by the heart. In a later interview, he admitted, "I was looking for a family I could believe in." The triadic relationship with Leona and Bunky wasn't born out of lust, but out of an emotional philosophy Jack had nurtured for years: love without possession, partnership without ownership. He once said, "I don't believe love has to be exclusive to be real." It was a deeply personal ethos, not a publicity stunt. But in the harsh spotlight of Australian media, it was interpreted as deviant, immoral, or worse, dangerous. The real pain came not from the media storm, but from the slow unraveling of what he considered his emotional sanctuary. When Bunky ended the relationship, it wasn't with fury, but fatigue. Living in quiet defiance of the world is a burden not easily shared. Leona remained with Jack longer, but eventually the unconventional household dissolved. The separation wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, reflective, much like Jack himself. But it cut deep. Publicly, Jack never lashed out. He never tried to correct headlines or counter the moral backlash with venom. Instead, he chose silence. He focused on his work. He poured his soul into his roles, some of which seemed to mirror his personal dilemmas. In The Sum of Us, 1994, he played a widowed father learning to accept his son's homosexuality, a performance so warm and vulnerable it felt autobiographical. As if Jack was asking the public again to expand their definition of love. In private, he spoke candidly to friends. The pain of public judgment, the loneliness that followed the end of his most unconventional but most emotionally sincere relationship. He remained close to both Leona and Bunky for years. They had lived something rare together, and no amount of headlines could reduce that. The media, for their part, never truly knew what to make of Jack. One year, he'd be celebrated as an Aussie icon. The next, quietly critiqued for his alternative lifestyle. But his legacy was hard to tarnish. He wasn't erratic or reckless. He didn't chase scandal or use his personal life for leverage. He simply lived according to principles that many weren't ready to accept. One journalist wrote, "Jack Thompson didn't just act in new wave films, he lived like one." That was the truth. His life was a narrative of disruption, challenge, and transformation. And the love triangle that shocked a nation wasn't just tabloid fodder. It was the manifestation of a deep, lifelong yearning to build a family not based on convention, but on trust, choice, and emotional truth. And while Australia debated the morality of his choices, Jack quietly carried the emotional weight of them. Never defensive, never ashamed. Just a man who tried to love deeply and paid the quiet price of being misunderstood. It's easy to look back at Jack Thompson's story and frame it in extremes, either as a noble rebellion against convention or as a scandalous chapter best left in the margins of Australian celebrity history. But to do so would be to miss the complexity of the man entirely. Jack Thompson wasn't trying to shock anyone. He wasn't chasing headlines or redefining love as a publicity stunt. What he did, what he lived, was the quiet revolution of a man who refused to let society dictate the terms of his emotional life. He took an enormous personal risk by sharing something most public figures would have kept hidden. And in doing so, he exposed a deeply human question. What happens when love doesn't fit the rules? We often celebrate actors for the roles they play, but rarely for the courage they display off-screen. Jack's decision to live in a long-term relationship with two sisters, And more importantly, to speak about it openly, was not a moment of arrogance. It was a test of integrity. He didn't lie, he didn't pretend, and he didn't retreat when the world turned its back for a while. This channel doesn't glorify scandal for its own sake, but we do believe in unearthing stories that were silenced, misunderstood, or oversimplified. And Jack Thompson's story is all of that. Yes, it's provocative, but it's also profoundly human. It's about a man shaped by abandonment and loss who went on to create his own definition of love, family, and emotional truth, even when it cost him. Professionally, Jack remains one of the most respected figures in Australian film. His contribution to cinema is undeniable. He helped shape the national identity on screen at a time when Australia was still searching for its voice. His performances carried gravitas, vulnerability, and fierce authenticity. He played characters who stood up against injustice, who loved deeply, and who wrestled with conscience, not unlike the man himself. Personally, he remains a figure of quiet defiance, not a provocateur, but a man of principle. The very qualities that drew people to his performances, emotional depth, quiet strength, philosophical detachment, were the same ones that shaped his real life. And in a world obsessed with conformity, perhaps that's the most radical thing of all. We ask you, the audience, what would you have done in his place? Could you have lived so openly, so vulnerably? Could you have handled the judgment, the misinterpretation, the emotional toll? Or do we still, even now, expect our icons to live simple, explainable lives? Love, like legacy, rarely follows a script, and Jack Thompson, for all his fame, never pretended it did. Somewhere in the folds of Australian cinema history, Jack Thompson's name still echoes, not just as an actor, but as a man who dared to live with open wounds and open love. When we watch Breaker Morant or The Man from Snowy River, we don't just see a character. We see Jack, composed but quietly aching, strong but never unreachable. There's something in his eyes, a memory, a question left unanswered, a shadow of the life he lived beyond the camera. The world has changed since the days when his three-way relationship made headlines. We speak more openly now about non-traditional love, about chosen families, about the many forms intimacy can take. But back then, Jack stood almost alone, quietly bearing the judgment, refusing to flinch. And that perhaps is what makes his story linger. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was brave. Leona King passed away in 2017. Jack was by her side. Bunky had long since moved on with her life, but the connection they once shared, the strange, beautiful, fragile triangle they built together, remains a part of Australian lore, even if spoken in hushed tones. Not everyone understood it. Not everyone forgave it, but no one ever forgot it. There's a tenderness in remembering him now, still alive, still working, still reflecting. Jack Thompson never asked to be a symbol. He only ever asked to live truthfully. And maybe that's why, even decades later, we still lean in a little closer when his name is mentioned. Because his life wasn't just a story. It was a mirror of what we fear, what we crave, and what we dare not say out loud. Some stories are never told. But now you know. And maybe that's all Jack ever wanted. Not applause, not absolution, just to be seen. Truly seen.